your decisions can only be as good as the data that you are working with. And the only way to get real data about what is actually going on around you is presence. Everything else is a story that your mind is producing. Precisely when the stakes are highest, when we are under most pressure, we are most likely to be on autopilot while we're feeling completely in command.
Lucia, I'm really glad we're doing this. A lot of conversations talk about decisions like they happen in a clean room. Here's the data. Here are the options. Here's the strategy. Here's what we should do. But in real companies, decisions don't pass through a spreadsheet first, right? They pass through a person. And that person might be tired, might be tense, might be trying not to show frustration. They might be trying not to disappoint the team, the board, the customer, or themselves. And somehow, in the middle of all that, we still expect them to make a clear decision. That's why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because I usually look at where decisions get stuck in the system. Unclear ownership, repeated escalation, decisions that keep coming back upward. But your work helps explain what happens inside a person who keeps receiving all that pressure. So let me start there. When pressure shows up, before we can explain it logically, what actually happens inside us?
First of all, thanks for having me, Marco. Very excited to be on your podcast. This is a great question. And actually, from a research perspective, stress has a set of well-documented effects on the brain. And they also map almost exactly onto what I was watching happen around me when I was in an executive role over the last 15 years as well. So under pressure, the same things break down again and again. Number one, our focus narrows and our long-term thinking collapses. Priorities literally flip upside down. So this can look like you starting to manage the small, the immediate things instead of focusing on the big things that actually matter. For example, I worked with more than one CEO who became obsessed with the wording on the website or the icons in the product, while the team was completely starving for vision and strategic direction. And so this kind of behavior from the outside, it can look quite bizarre, but it is a textbook stress response to fixate on the small stuff while avoiding the big things. So that's number one. Number two, our amygdala becomes hyperactive. So we get more emotionally reactive. We can become either anxious and avoidant or irritable and combative. For example, I worked with a CEO once who would publicly snap at anyone who raised a problem or challenged a management decision, right? And guess what? People stopped speaking up. Problems got swept under the rug, and that became a big issue down the road. And so now something like this might look like a character flaw on the CEO's side, but it's actually also a textbook stress response, emotional reactivity. That's number two. Number three, the prefrontal cortex, which is our executive center, effectively goes offline. So we lose access to complex strategic thinking as the more primal parts of the brain take over. Now, these are faster, but they are far less sophisticated. And so this shows up as black and white thinking and snap judgments, because we literally lose the capacity to process complex information effectively. So we dismiss anything that doesn't fit our preconceived notion about a situation, even though this is exactly the data points we should be paying extra attention to. So that's number three. Number four, our threat and risk perception gets skewed. For example, you might see threat where there is none. Get defensive when someone is just providing you constructive feedback or a new idea, a new perspective. But here the relationship between stress and risk perception is not exactly linear. It's a bit more complex because acute and chronic stress have a slightly different impact on your risk perception. So depending on which state you're in, you might end up either making decisions that are too risky because you underestimate the risk, or decisions that are too conservative because you overestimate it. So that was number 4. And number 5, under pressure, we also tend to get more rigid and righteous. I'm right, you are wrong. My way or the highway. And so we lose the ability to hold another perspective and solve a hard problem together in collaboration. I was, for example, once in a merger situation where the leadership team could literally not move forward for a full year because both sides were so locked into protecting their own product and culture, each blaming the other for the lack of collaboration. And so these are different ways what can happen when we're under pressure and when we're stressed. And the thread running through all of these 5 points that I just mentioned is none of them are character flaws. They are physiological states. And this is exactly why they also can be changed.
CEOs, any leader, need better language for pressure, right? Because pressure doesn't make smart leaders stupid. It makes their world smaller. So it's same brain, but fewer options. And we often talk about pressure like it's just something strong people should handle. But I feel that that's too vague. Pressure comes with the seat, yes. Nobody becomes a CEO or senior leader and says, I was promised a peaceful inbox. But the real question is, what does pressure take away from your decision making? And that's why your path is so interesting to me, because you've seen this from inside leadership, not just from the outside. You've had a really interesting path from C-level tech leadership into breath and nervous system work. And I was wondering, can you tell us a little bit about that journey? I'm especially curious what you started noticing about pressure, clarity, and decision-making along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. So I spent 15 years in technology, building startups from zero to global market leaders, one of them becoming unicorn. I sat in a C-level role 3 times. And what I learned is, well, in a startup, you're always under pressure. It's a bit like jumping out of a plane and then trying to build your parachute on the way down. I think that's a very accurate comparison. You are often selling a product that is not built yet. You're trying to create traction fast with very limited resources. And the odds are generally stacked against you. So roughly half of the startups don't survive their first 5 years. So you're always kind of facing an existential threat. And that means that the people in the leadership carry an enormous load, an enormous amount of pressure that they're under. And here's what I kept noticing during those 15 years. You lose access to your best thinking at the exact moment when you need it most. It's in the investor pitch that decides your next 18 months. When you're trying to close the deal that makes a quarter. When you are navigating a merger and every choice compounds. And I think that irony is that we treat our cognitive capacity as if it was fixed. It is not. The quality of your thinking depends on the state of your nervous system. And when you are stressed, your most complex, strategic, higher thinking can drop by 30 to 40%. And so that's how your judgment becomes erratic precisely when the stakes are highest. And so that also means that when you learn to regulate your nervous system, you can protect your thinking and your judgment under pressure. And beyond protecting it, you can also expand it. Sharper focus, better access to creativity, intuition, strategic, visionary thinking. And so seeing how much this costs leaders and how much more effective they can become once they regulate their own physiology I decided to switch sides. And so now I help leaders build resilience, think clearly, and lead more effectively under pressure.
That's why I think your perspective is interesting in all of this, because you're not coming at this from outside the room. So you've been in the actual room, you've seen the deadlines, commercial pressure, you had difficult conversations, more than a few, right? And you experienced the pace. So this is not leaders should relax more, it's more serious than that. And from your own leadership experience, when the pressure was high, what did you notice about how people made decisions?
I noticed a few things. I would say there are a few stereotypes that people can fall into when they're under pressure. And I think the type of stereotype that shows up for you kind of depends on your individual proclivity. What I think is a shared sign across people is that the mind becomes overactive. This is something that you obviously notice internally. It can show up as mind wandering or racing thoughts or rumination. What tends to be visible externally is that you might have a difficulty listening to other people, just taking in the information that is in the room, being able to process it. You can get this sense of information overload. What's also quite common is to feel like you get a sense of a brain fog and decision fatigue, or even decision paralysis, like being unable to make a decision. I've seen many executives and CEO kind of like kick the strategic decisions down the road because they were just not able to make a choice whether to do A or B. So avoiding making decisions, I think, tends to be quite a significant problem under overload for many people. Also, what is quite common is to slip into a black and white thinking. So this is kind of like where the cognitive capacity gets negatively affected by the stress. We fall back into the parts of the brain that are faster, but more primal, more primitive in a way. So we tend to develop a more simplistic perception of reality, almost a caricature of reality, because we can't tolerate the complexity. We can't hold paradox, especially, which, especially I would say in high level leadership roles, being able to hold paradox is an essential ability. But when we're stressed, we lose that ability and we fall into this habitual decision making, black and white thinking, more polarized perspective. Also, it can show up as a more pessimistic view. Stress is known to color our perception more negatively, so everything looks a little bit more negative, a little bit more pessimistic, a little bit more threatening. And then I think where I saw most individual differences is in the emotional reaction. So some people have a default to fall into more anxiety or maybe even avoidance. And other people have so that's kind of the people who have a default flight response or even freeze response to stress. And then other people get irritable, get defensive, get combative. This is the fight response showing up under stress. And so I would say probably most leaders will recognize at least 2 or 3 of these, at least from their own hardest weeks. I can certainly recognize several of these points in myself. So it's not just me preaching or talking about what I have observed in other leaders. Sure, it is more difficult to notice these in yourself, but I definitely observed a lot of them in myself. And I think what's important also to, again, emphasize, none of these are character flaws. They are physiological states, which is exactly why they can be trained.
And that distinction matters, right? Because in a way, rush decision can look like leadership from the outside. Sometimes it can look like clarity, and it can look like you being decisive in the moment, but sometimes it's not clarity at all. So it's in a way discomfort trying to end the meeting. And you mentioned that you already know when something is creeping up, but when a leader is overloaded, what are the usual signs they may still look composed externally, but internally they're losing access to clarity?
Mm-hmm. I would say the first thing to go is usually presence. The capacity to actually listen to people. If you notice that you are spending more time inside your own head, analyzing, rehearsing, ruminating, and so on, rather than being present to what is happening in the room, this is an early warning sign. And I'm not talking about sitting down to think through a problem. Obviously, like if you're sitting down at your desk and you're thinking about it, you're in your head. But I'm talking about the situations where you're in a room, you're in a meeting, and you're not listening because you're running your internal narrative, or maybe you're completely distracted thinking about something else. And here's why this matters so much. Your decisions can only be as good as the data that you are working with. And the only way to get real data about what is actually going on around you is presence. Everything else is a story that your mind is producing. And so the way I see it, mind wandering and distraction is a data quality problem for the brain. We all have had the experience of being in a conversation and the other person finishes talking and you realize you have no idea what they just said, right? Have you ever experienced that?
Yeah, for sure.
I think we all have, right? And so this is interesting because brain imaging studies show that when we drop into our own heads, so this mind wandering or self-referential thinking as well, the brain's processing of external inputs, external sensory input actually quiets down. So you can see it on the brain scans. When you're in your head, you actually stop processing external sensory information. You are physically in the room, but you have stopped taking reality in. And the problematic thing with this is that our brain hates gaps. So it fills the gaps with biased beliefs, assumptions, projections, extrapolations from the past. In other words, fiction. Right? None of that is real. And so the more time a leader spends not present in the room, the more erratic their decisions become, because you cannot make good decisions on corrupted fictional data, and only presence can give you real data. But I think the reason why this is hard to become aware of from the inside is because if you're in your head, you feel like you're working on the problem, right? Like you're thinking, you're analyzing, you're ruminating, but you think you're problem solving. And I used to spend a lot of time in my head. I also have a strong proclivity for that. Like I was a chess player when I was a kid. And so like I kind of always been in my head and calculating all these different scenarios and so on. But the reality is like when you do that while you're supposed to be perceiving what's happening or receiving information from your environment, is actually going to lead to worse decision making, not better.
This is so relatable, right? Pressure doesn't always look like panic, as you mentioned. Now, sometimes it looks very professional. People know how to handle the pressure, or at least know how to fake it. But inside, it sounds like urgency. It sounds like, for some people, it also sounds like standards, right? Just handling the stress nowadays. It sounds like I'm just being direct. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's not strategy. Sometimes it's your nervous system wearing a blazer. In your experience, where do you see leaders misread their own state, thinking they're being rational when they may actually be reacting from pressure?
That's a great question. And I would say the honest answer is that our unconscious runs far more of the show than we like to believe. In general, always. And neuroscience actually shows that many everyday decisions are prepared unconsciously. And the conscious choice often arises after the brain has already started acting. So it's kind of an ex post rationalization. We write a rational story to explain a decision the body has already largely made. And the more stressed we are, the more the brain defaults to automatic, habitual response patterns instead of deliberate choice. So precisely when the stakes are highest, when we are under most pressure, we are most likely to be on autopilot while we're feeling completely in command. So that's one thing. And there is an even deeper irony here, which is the more disconnected we are from our body and from our emotions, the more they run us. There is very fascinating research that shows that better interoceptive awareness, so the ability to sense and feel sensations happening in your body, is linked to better, more rational decision making, especially under uncertainty. So the leaders who think they have risen above their physiology are usually the ones most governed by it. So I would say if you think you're rational because you don't feel your emotions, it's almost certain they're running the show without you realizing. And the less aware you are of your emotions, the less conscious control you have over your decisions and actions, and the more your emotions are actually running the show without you realizing.
Can someone sound very logical, but still be operating from a narrow state?
100%. And I think this is related to this phenomenon of the ex post rationalization, right? Like you're making an absolutely emotional decision. And you can, like create all kinds of narratives on top of that to make it sound rational, logical, analytical, and so on. And I would say the way how you often could recognize that it is not a rational decision is when you notice your position being very rigid and you're not actually open to other people perhaps challenging it, or you're not open to considering other perspectives. So when you find yourself in this righteous state, that's where I would say you're most likely to be hijacked by your emotions rather than by, rational thinking.
In my opinion, that's where decision load gets expensive, right? Because the leader may not feel reactive. They may feel certain. And certainty under pressure can be very convincing, as you said. So that's the dangerous part here. A bad state doesn't always sound chaotic. Sometimes it sounds extremely confident, depending, of course, on those company's culture, your own personality, upbringing. There are a lot of factors here in meetings, difficult conversations, or even moments where a decision needs to be made.
So I would say the overall shows up as a fairly recognizable cluster. You can notice your mind is overactive, mind wandering, racing thoughts, rumination, right? Lack of presence or difficulty being present in the room, difficulty listening and taking in information. Also from the inside, a sense of information overload. It can show up as brain fog and decision fatigue, or even decision paralysis, being unable to move forward and make a decision. Or also the opposite of it, snap judgments, right? Emotional or quick decisions that come out of emotional reactivity rather than careful deliberation. It can show up as a black and white polarized thinking, or also sliding into pessimism and perceiving threats more strongly, but also like sometimes the risk perception being skewed towards the other side and underestimating threats. And last but not least, the emotional reactiveness that we were already talking about, feeling anxious or avoidant, or maybe on the other side of the spectrum, irritable or defensive, combative, snapping at people who, challenge your perspective. So these are some of the patterns that can show up.
I was wondering what happens to listening when the room gets tense. And you mentioned that by yourself, that the capacity to actually listen narrows, right? Or
Yes.
becomes smaller.
The capacity to actually listen is often the first thing to go out of the window. And also that something that kind of like goes hand in hand with that, also our capacity for empathy goes out of the window. So it is actually quite well researched or documented in research that the more stressed we are, the more selfish and the less empathetic we become.
So in your experience, do people usually rush the decision, avoid the decision, or just pass it upward when they're under the stress?
I'd say it depends a little bit on a couple of factors, definitely on the individual preference. So I have seen leaders that have a more tendency towards procrastinating. I have seen leaders that have a tendency more towards kind of like getting the decision over with very fast and snap judgments. But I think a lot of times it also depends on the type of decision, kind of like the level. Like, is this like a very high impact, high level strategic decision, or is this a more operational decision? So I think a lot of times it can be making the more operational decisions, like very quickly, almost recklessly, but then really kick the can down the road when it comes to the big strategic decision. So I've been in situations several times where the team was demanding, a vision and a strategic direction from the CEO, and the CEO was so overloaded that it took 5, 6, 7 months to just get started on it in a situation where it was already acutely necessary. So I think it really depends.
I see this a lot with decisions in general. The meeting technically happens, right? Mm-hmm. People talk, someone summarizes next steps, everyone nods, of course, and somehow the actual decision is still floating around the room. Everyone feels relief because the meeting ended, but the decision didn't close at all. So the discomfort just moved. In my work, I often see pressure built because decisions keep coming back upward. From your perspective, what happens to a leader when they become the place where all the unresolved pressure lands?
That's a great question. I think on the one hand, it obviously creates a lot of additional pressure on the leader as they become a bottleneck. But what I've seen is a lot of times is the irony of, like in situations like this, like the leader might be on the outside kind of complaining and be like, oh, I have to decide everything and so on and so on. But then behind the scenes, kind of like actually sabotage themselves and be the source and the reason of this situation and why people are unable to make decisions, either because the mandates are not clear. I've been in situations where, for example, the merger that I already mentioned before, where for over a year after the merger, the mandates were not clarified, even on a C level. It was not clear like who is responsible for what. And so obviously like all decisions in the whole company were stalled. Because this high-level direction was not provided, and so I think a lot of times leaders can see the smaller decisions come back up if they are unable to provide clarity on the high level, on the strategic direction, on the vision, on the high-level objectives, and also clarity on roles and responsibilities.
Can a leader become addicted to urgency because calm feels like losing control?
Absolutely. I think for a lot of leaders, like even when they on the outside are complaining that everything lands on their plate, there's probably a deep unconscious reason of them still creating that situation for themselves because they need to feel needed. And I think this is really hard to admit when that is you who's creating this dependency in the organization.
Yeah, for sure. What does pressure actually do to courage? Do people become more aggressive or actually less brave in your experience?
I'd say this again depends on what is your default stress response. So if your default stress response is flight or freeze, the more pressure you're under, the more likely you are to escape decisions or avoid confrontations, and overall your courage goes out of the window. If your default stress response is fight, right, then I think it's more likely that you show up, at least externally, looking more courageous. It could be also more argumentative, more combative, more righteous, but overall more courageous. So I think it really depends on the default stress response. And I would say from my perspective, none of them are right or wrong or better or worse, right? It's really all about awareness. And once you understand what your default response is, then you can decide more consciously how you actually want to show up.
Is it sometimes harder to teach someone how to handle stress and pressure depending on their background, personality type, upbringing, or just environment where they spend?
Yeah, definitely. I would say so. To handle pressure as well as to collaborate effectively under pressure when you have people with different backgrounds and different, let's say, default constitution. So I've experienced a similar situation maybe than you were referring to in terms of the cultural clash. So I personally come from Eastern Europe, which is a very straightforward, direct, decisive culture, I would say. I have worked for the first 10 years of my career in Germany, which is also a fairly straightforward culture. And then 5 years ago, I switched to work for a Swedish company, which was an absolute culture shock for me. And I don't mean this in a negative way, but it was very different. This kind of like much more softer, consensus oriented, let's have a group meeting around it. And the management being very careful about not prescribing the team too much, be like, no, that the team needs to be autonomous, like everyone needs to be involved in a decision making. So it was actually interesting to also see in that particular constellation in the context of this Swedish, non-hierarchical, consensus-based culture, to see how, especially the executives that were coming from a different cultural background, Eastern European / German like myself, or Russian American, and so on, how they showed up completely differently. And actually under pressure, the culture clash got kind of amplified, which also made the decision making more difficult in some circumstances.
And you also mentioned the default state of people, right? It's just somehow the state in which people operate or get used to operate. So I was wondering, for leaders who are under a lot of stress nowadays with the culture of just biting through it, and surviving the stress, what happens if that becomes their normal operating state?
So if being chronically stressed becomes your normal operating state, it is not just your well-being that erodes. Your decision-making capacity erodes because your cognitive capacity erodes. And I think this is the thing that leaders need to become more aware of, because from my own experience, what I've seen a lot of times is, obviously everyone knows that stress is bad for your health, for your well-being, but a lot of executives just take it as a sacrifice that they are willing to bring, right? And now whether that is a smart thing to sacrifice or not is a different discussion. But they're like, okay, I'm kind of sacrificing my health for, the company because this is important, because we're in an urgent, state and so on. In a startup, you're always in a constant state of urgency, for example. But it's not just that. It's not just your health and well-being that you're sacrificing. You're sacrificing the quality of your decisions. And so now it kind of becomes ironic because you're sacrificing your decision-making company for the company. So you're kind of sacrificing the company for the company, because when your decision-making becomes erratic, that is negatively affecting the company. And that's kind of like where the argument becomes circular, and where I think leaders should, A, become aware of it, and B, start becoming more proactive about actively managing their stress and regulating their nervous system, or learning how to regulate their nervous system more effectively so they can regain the clarity and cognitive capacity and make better decisions.
So, in your words, what do high-performing people classify as discipline, but it's actually underlying stress? Are there any markers or indications?
I'd say in general, overworking. And I think this is a bit of a fine line to navigate, though, because there's, on the other hand, there's also a movement, I feel like, starting to emerge that is promoting this like ideal work-life balance and working less and enjoying life more and so on. And I think that's wonderful if that's the path that you choose, more power to you. At the same time, I think for a lot of leaders in high stakes positions, that is just not realistic, right? Like, it's not necessarily realistic that your work week ends at 40 hours, or that you never check your emails after 5 p.m. It just doesn't happen. But I think what is worth rethinking, though, is to prioritize high quality recovery time. So yes, you can work hard and you can push hard, but you need to have a routine where you can recover very effectively. And this is not just about reducing your working hours, or it is not just about having more leisure time. It is also a matter of the quality of the relaxation, right? Like, for example, if you're on your couch in the evening at 11 p.m. or midnight, watching some YouTube videos or scrolling on Instagram, or like whatever your activity of choice is to procrastinate on going to sleep. Now, that might feel like you're resting because you're not working, but you're not actually resting. And so I think this is more of a mindset switch that requires thinking about the quality of the recovery that you get.
How do I repair the room after I realize I reacted instead of responded to the actual pressure? Is it too late?
I don't think it's too late. I actually think that showing the insight and the awareness that you have overreacted and that you have harmed the trust in the room, and having the humility to admit it and to apologize, is great role modeling for the team.
This is where your world and mine meet, right? You're looking at where and what pressure does inside a leader. I'm trying to look at why the system keeps sending that pressure back to them. And leaders need both lenses, because yes, the leader may need better regulation. They may need breath space, recovery, and the ability not to let the reactions becoming the next problem in a way. But sometimes also the system is asking one person to recover from pressure that should never keep landing on them in the first place. So if the only way the system stays stable is one person constantly recovering, you don't have stability in the company. You have a very tired human buffer. And to me, that is decision load. The org chart says who should decide. The escalation pattern tells you who is actually carrying the pressure. So I'm curious, how can a leader tell the difference between pressure they need to regulate personally and pressure that is actually a signal that the system is unclear?
That's a great question. The thing is, just by being honest with themselves and reflecting on whether certain decisions actually need to be landing on their shoulders. And that, I believe, is easier said than done. So a lot of times, I think there is actually a lot of value of getting an external advisor or consultant in, perhaps like yourself, to give you a more clear perspective on that. Because the reality is that most leaders like to feel needed and indispensable. And by the way, I'm completely with you on the need for systemic solutions. And interestingly, the science here is also very clear that the most effective interventions when it comes to nervous system regulation within an organization are the ones that combine the individual level intervention, like nervous system work, breath work, and so on. It can be a couple of things. And systemic intervention, which could be, like a different decision of the decision mandates or incentive structure, or even things like the physical environment that you work in, the noise levels, and so on, right? And it's very well demonstrated that individual interventions alone are not as effective as combined, and also systemic interventions alone are not as effective as combined interventions. So you really need both layers. And this is true not just for the team or the organization, but this is true also for the leader themselves, for the system that they create for themselves.
My view is that there has to be a balance, right? And we're coming in a way, we're looking through different lenses at the same problem. So I also wanted to ask you, what role can breath or nervous system regulation play in helping leaders create a little more space before they respond?
Mm-hmm. So breath is the most direct lever that we have to shift the nervous system, to flip the switch, if you will, from a stress state into calm and clarity. The immediate effect of that can be felt literally within minutes, and it feels like more presence, more calm, a clearer head before you walk into the room. And a lot of times it gives you just this like second or two to pause and reflect before you respond, which leads to a very different response. Now, what is less widely understood is what happens with consistent practice over a few weeks or a few months. These altered states start becoming an altered trait. So now you are not only calmer while you practice or right after, the state of calm and clarity becomes your new baseline, your default throughout the day. You can notice that the small things that used to set you off start to bounce off. Emotional resilience becomes more effortless. And from that steadier baseline, you can keep thinking, you can keep access to clear thinking under pressure instead of falling back into this, what I sometimes call Neanderthal mode. And by the way, it takes less than you would think to gain access to some of these long-term baseline effects. What I've seen with my clients, 15 to 20 minutes of intentional breathing a day is enough. And it doesn't even require you carving out extra time, or it doesn't even have to be in one session. You can sprinkle it over the day. 3 minutes here in between meetings, 5 minutes there while you're drinking your coffee or while you're in your Uber on the way to the next meeting. And so you can do literally 3 to 5 micro breaks of just a few minutes throughout the day. And in the course of a couple of weeks, you can start noticing this space, this pause between a situation and your reaction to become more natural and more effortless.
I like the word space more than calm in a way, because in a way, calm can sound unrealistic, right? A leader may not feel calm before a high stakes meeting. And that's fine. Fair enough. The goal is not to feel zen while the room is on fire. The goal is to create just enough space, as you mentioned, so your reaction doesn't become the next fire. So for leaders who are skeptical about this topic, how would you explain it in a grounded, most practical way without making it sound like wellness language?
Mm-hmm. So the whole thing makes sense the moment you understand how the nervous system actually works. To put it in science terms rather than wellness terms. Your autonomic nervous system governs all of your physiology, heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, everything, also brain function. And it has two main modes. The sympathetic branch, which is the gas pedal that mobilizes you for action, and the parasympathetic branch, which is the brake, restores calm and recovery, the state of inner peace, if you will. Now, the state of this autonomic nervous system determines how you feel, how you think, and how you act in any given moment. Much more than your conscious intention, by the way. So when you are in an overactivated fight or flight state, the higher cognitive functions go offline and the more primal parts of the brain take over. So this is where you temporarily turn into a Neanderthal. Here's the key, and this is the part that lands with analytical people. In general, the autonomic nervous system runs outside of your conscious control. That's the reason why it's called autonomic, right? It runs by itself. You're generally not trying to consciously steer it, like you don't have to think of beating your heart, which is great. But generally, most of it, we also cannot consciously influence, right? You cannot simply decide to slow down your heart rate or to lower your blood pressure when you're in the fight or flight Neanderthal mode. Breath is the single exception to this rule. Breath is the only function of the autonomic nervous system that you can consciously control, right? Like you can decide to slow your breath down in this moment, right? And when you slow your breath, now your heart rate follows, your blood pressure settles, also your brain waves harmonize. And so you can exit the Neanderthal mode. And that means that by controlling your breath, you can shift the entire nervous system, you can activate this brake on demand, and you can restore balance and bring your prefrontal cortex and higher thinking back online. And so breath is the most direct way to control the state of the nervous system, and through it, how we feel, how we think, and also how we decide and act. It quite literally gives you the power to choose the state that you want to be in, rather than being swept along by unconscious programming and turning into a Neanderthal under pressure. So to sum it up, the work at its simplest is about learning to replace unconscious dysfunctional breathing with conscious functional breathing that controls your state, that allows you to set your state. There's nothing mystical or esoteric about it. It's not wishful thinking. It is literally applied physiology. It's a mechanical switch that is built into your nervous system, a kind of a secret backdoor into your nervous system. And I think that's pretty cool. And this is also why I think breath is such an amazing practice, because it is much more accessible, for example, than meditation. What I have noticed, both from my own experience with myself, as well as working with several of my clients, if you have a very active mind, and if you're in general in a very wired state, meditation can feel daunting or inaccessible, and it can be a very frustrating experience. And it seems to me like breath is a more accessible practice for many people because the settling down is faster. It's not just that you sit down and over months and years of practice, like you kind of wait for your mind to calm down. It's that you flip a mechanical switch And when your body settles down, your mind automatically settles down. So you kind of approach it from the other side. You're not trying to control your mind directly. You control the state of your physiology, and your mind just goes along with it. It's pretty amazing how effective it is and how simple it is also. And the thing that I love about breath the most is that it's a tool that you can access anytime, anywhere, completely for free. And I actually suspect that that might be the reason why still many people are not very aware of it, right? It's like the whole longevity space now is like focus on the latest fancy supplements and tech and so on, and spending thousands of euros on fancy solutions to to improve your health and well-being and performance, when perhaps the single most effective intervention to increase your well-being and cognitive performance has been with you, literally under your nose, since you were born, and most of us don't pay attention to it.
What would you say to a CEO who says, I don't need breathwork, I need better decisions under pressure? How do you make this serious for people who live in commercial reality, like you were for 15 years?
You can't make good decisions from an operating system that is not functioning well. If your nervous system is out of balance, you simply don't have access to your full cognitive capacity. You're making decisions at, maybe 60, 70% of your capacity. You cannot make an optimal decision without actually tapping into your full cognitive capacity. And you cannot tap into your full cognitive capacity when your nervous system is dysregulated. That's nothing mystical or esoteric. It's just basic physiology, basic science.
Exactly. That's why I think this belongs in a serious business conversation. If we call it wellness too early, like some people could, some leaders will or might dismiss it, right? But if we call it decision quality under pressure, now we're in their world, right? So this is not about being soft. It's about not making expensive decisions from a bad state. Simple as that. And the goal is not to make leaders superhuman. The goal is to stop building systems that require superhuman recovery. What is one small practice a leader can use before a high-stakes meeting, decision, or even a stressful conversation to come in more regulated and clear?
So there are 3 basics of functional breathing to remember always, but especially when you're going into a decision situation. Number 1, breathe through your nose. It is way more important than you realize. And when you pay attention, actually, you might notice that you are breathing through your mouth quite often, especially when you're stressed. So number 1, always breathe through your nose. Number 2, low. You want to learn to root your breath low into your lower body. Imagine almost as if you're trying to draw the breath down all the way towards your tailbone. So breathing into your belly, at least. Even better if you can breathe all the way down into your seat. And of course, we don't have a lung in our abdomen, but if you breathe deeply into the lower lobes of the lungs, the diaphragm pushes down and you can feel this pressure as a sensation of breath in your lower body. So number 2, learn to anchor your breath low. And number 3 is to slow down. Most of us breathe way too fast. When you slow down, especially the exhale, that's a very effective way to calm your nervous system down. So this should be your baseline throughout the whole day. Nose, low, slow. But especially if you're going into high stakes meeting, I recommend take just 10 slow nasal breaths into your lower body. Right? Imagine you're breathing all the way down towards your tailbone and make the exhale longer than the inhale. Maybe breathing in for 3, breathing out for 6, or in for 4, out for 8, depending on what your capacity is in that moment. So just 10 breaths and you will be surprised how much shifts in under 2 minutes. It's a very different baseline state that you enter the meeting with. And that's a simple, easy entry point. At the same time, I also want to be honest about what those 10 breaths are and what they are not. These 10 breaths can pull you out of an acute spike or prime you between going into a decision situation. They cannot change your baseline. And so if you're walking into every meeting already kind of being on the edge, already depleted, already overwhelmed, these 10 breaths are a good last-minute rescue, but they're not a long-term solution because you're putting out a fire instead of building a nervous system that does not catch fire so easily. And so this is where I always tell my clients that the real shift happens when this becomes a trained capacity. With the right protocols, even 15 to 20 minutes a day, the change moves from state to trait. Your resting baseline calms down. Your range under pressure goes up. You recover faster, you hold complexity longer, and you stop losing access to your best thinking when you need it. And so with long-term practice, you can also not just strengthen your resilience and stabilize your cognitive performance under pressure, but you can also expand your cognitive capacity beyond your known baseline, access more creativity, more intuition, more visionary thinking, expand your perception, read the room, not just hear what is said, perceive what is not being said. And this obviously takes a long-term commitment and also the knowledge of different breath techniques because different techniques train different capacities, but it's absolutely worth it. I can say for myself, it's the biggest game changer that I have discovered in my entire life for my own leadership. And this is the work that I now do with leaders, building the practice into how you already operate so that regulation becomes your default, not your last minute rescue before a meeting. So the 10 breaths are how you feel that this is real. And the deeper practice is how you make it permanent and access deeper effects beyond just feeling calm and clear in the moment. And so I would say if that's something that you're working on, this is exactly the conversation that I like to have.
That's useful because it's small enough to actually use, right? Most leaders are not going to redesign their entire nervous system before the next Tuesday meeting, right? That's not the reality, but they can take 30 seconds, 2 minutes before they walk in. And sometimes that's, as you mentioned, the difference between leading the room and leaking pressure into it.
What I love about it is you can start really small, right? Literally 10 breaths or 5 minutes. And then slowly build from there and start weaving it into more and more moments throughout the day. You can start with the idle moments. I think that the nice thing is you don't need to allocate extra time. You can stack it with other things you're already doing, drinking your coffee, commuting to work, waiting to board the plane, in any situations. And with time, as you gain more practice, you can actually start using this conscious breathing also in a meeting. Basically, anytime you're not speaking, you can be breathing consciously, and it allows you to be more present and more perceptive to what's going on. I have one client that I like to give as an example. He started literally with 5 minutes a day. This was 2 years ago. And over time, he found it so impactful that he started doing it more and more and more to the point where now he's breathing intentionally 6 to 7 hours every day. Now, this is not someone that is retired or on a sabbatical, just to be clear. This is an executive making decisions with €1 billion impact on a daily basis. And he finds it so important, so powerful that he makes it a priority. And at the same time, it doesn't cost extra time. You can do it in parallel to your normal day-to-day activities.
And that's the most important part for people to realize that it doesn't take 5 hours a day, right? Nor you need to leave the room. You don't need anything specific. You just need technique.
Exactly.
Lucia, I'm really glad we spoke today because I think that you make pressure practical, not fluffy, not dramatic, but simple and practical. And nowadays, in today's age, that matters because pressure does not always make leaders fall apart. Sometimes it makes them sound more certain, more direct, more urgent, more in control, but in a way, underneath, they may have less access to very things good decisions require: patience, perspective, listening, courage, or just judgment. And that's the part I want leaders to hear. This is not about becoming softer. It's about not making expensive decisions from a bad state. And from my side, it also connects directly to decision load, because yes, leaders need tools to manage themselves under pressure, but I also need systems where every unclear decision does not keep coming back to them. Because when that happens for too long, the leader is not just leading anymore, they're absorbing. So let me end with this. What is the one thing you wish more leaders stopped calling just part of the job?
Let me actually think about this one a bit. I think the one thing that I wish leaders would stop thinking about as part of the job is the stress-induced cognitive impairment and the impaired decision-making that follows from that. You don't have to sacrifice your cognitive capacity, even when you're in a job where the pressure is an inherent part of it.
I think that's a great place to end this, because, as mentioned, I agree wholeheartedly with the approach, and I feel that we need more balance and not just black and white solution nowadays. And it's so much more than that, and we often forget about this human side of it. So before I let you go, where can people learn more about your work?
People can learn more about my work on my website, the-breath-lab.com, as well as on my LinkedIn profile, where I regularly share insights and information about how you can regulate your nervous system better with breath. Under Lucia Hegenbartova, you can find me on LinkedIn.
Amazing. Thank you very much once again for this. I feel it's extremely important conversation.
Yeah, thank you for the great conversation, Marco. I really enjoyed it. And yeah,
Thank you.
Good luck with your podcast.